Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is
Corey, $1 million Knockrunner. Where's my furry cat?
Worst.
I need to rub my furry cat.
The worst Dr. Evil impression I think I've ever seen. Ever.
I'm not an impressionist. At least he knew where I was going. Probably only because we recorded the joke before the intro.
Anyways, on today's episode, we will cover the latest in car hacking by Sam Curry. Before that, we'll go into JMagic packets targeting Juniper routers and switches. No, just routers. But before that, we'll have a bit of a discussion on, is the CVSS scoring system flawed and totally irreparable?
Just throw it with that, Mark. It sucks. It's gone. It's dead.
Yep.
Like AV, it's completely dead.
With that, let's go ahead and drive our way in.
Vroom, vroom.
So, Corey, I want to start this week with an interesting blog post that I saw. It popped up on r/cybersecurity early last week, and it caught my attention from the title and from the author once I actually landed on the page. So the title was "CVSS is Dead to Us." And it was written by Dan Stenberg, who is the founder and lead developer of curl and libcurl.
Yeah, not controversial at all. What a very tame and boring title, right?
And I assumed based off the title where it was going, and it was going pretty close to that. But it's a topic that even internally, we've kind of wrestled with when it comes to dealing with these what feel like arbitrary scoring systems for vulnerabilities. So before diving into his blog post, real quick, if you're not familiar with CVSS or the common vulnerability scoring system, it's a way to convert metrics or factors about a vulnerability into a 0.0 through 10.0 number, which you can then extrapolate into a severity of low, medium, high, critical. CVSS 4.0 was just released in November of 2023, I think. It takes into account factors like the attack complexity, whether there's any pre-existing conditions that need to be present, the actual attack vector, so you need network access or need to be on the machine itself, whether user interactions required, the privileges required, and then it also takes into factors the impact of the vulnerability. So what's the impact to the CIA triad? So confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Is it low or none? Partial or none, medium, or high on either of those?
None, partial, and complete, I think, for things like confidentiality, unless the Wikipedia is behind.
Correct. So, and it takes all those into account. You can use a fancy little calculator that's hosted everywhere, click a bunch of buttons, and it puts in a bunch of weights and spits out a 0 through 10.0 score of how severe your vulnerability is. But one of the things CVSS does is it's really just a worst case scenario severity rating for every vulnerability. It's if this is exploited and exposed, how severe could it be at worst? But there's
the other
a lot
thing
of factors
that
I
think we might get into the blog post is it also is very simplified in that if you have this software and you have this version, there's a vulnerability, but it doesn't necessarily have all the details of there's many situations where, yes, that version of software has a vulnerability, but only if it's compiled with these switches or only if it's used in this situation. And that type of nuance is kind of harder to display in CVS, as I'm sure we'll get into as we go further into the blog post.
Yeah, a great example of that is OpenSSL. It's a library used on Linux and I guess Windows machines too for encryption and basically anything to do with encryption. It's one of the most bloated libraries that there is these days, to the point where, wasn't it Google that released boring SSL or something like that, which was a super stripped down version of it. But OpenSSL, they've got vulnerabilities all the time. But lately they've been in how they handle certificates or how they handle Diffie-Hellman key exchanges. And if you aren't using that specific component of it, like you just said, yes, you may have a vulnerable version that's going to get picked up and flagged by vulnerability scanners. But if you're not using the specific vulnerable function, it's really not applicable. It's not a vulnerability in your system. So every CVE record for vulnerabilities is supposed to have a CVSS score. It's not like explicitly required, but it's heavily recommended for each of them to help just enrich the record and let most people make a quick decision of how severe is this issue. But like you said, there's a lot of nuance beyond that 0 to 10 score in there. Certified numbering authorities like WatchGuard, we're responsible for publishing that initial CVE record for vulnerabilities in our products.
By the way, that takes extra work, though, right? I mean, every vendor, every product or piece of software might have someone report to CVE to get the CVSS. But to be actually like to kind of own your own destiny, you have to do work to become that CNA. Not every vendor is a CNA, and a lot of companies get their vulnerabilities reported with CVS scores independent of them if they haven't taken those steps.
Exactly. But if you are a CNA, then you're responsible for setting that initial CVSS score. But if you don't, there's actually an entire process for handling that. It's called the Authorized Data Publishers, or ADPs, which are responsible for enriching CVE records. Like those in IT and security that have ever looked up a CVE, you've probably ended up on either MITRE's website, which is like the CVE service's like source of truth, or NVD, the National Vulnerability Database by, I think it's NIST. And historically, NIST and NVD were the ones that were enriching these records. And they were kind of just doing it for the heck of it. They were a special CNA that was allowed to go edit other CVEs. With the latest updates to the CVE program, they created this new ADP, or Authorized Data Publishers thing, which NVD would be one if they continued doing it. They basically, I think it was about a year ago, put out an announcement saying, we're done enriching CVEs. It's too much work. We can't handle it anymore. And CISA actually took over, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency. So now CISA goes through and adds on that enrichment anytime it sees a vulnerability that doesn't have the CVSS score. And this is where problems can arise, where like CISA in this case, or other ADPs, they don't know all the details about the vulnerability. They know what is published in the record, which is usually a couple of sentences. And if they have
maybe
time,
what
maybe
a
they can
researcher
go,
is posted if it was disclosed externally, I guess.
But they're doing like thousands of these a year, even tens of thousands. So I have to imagine, like, except for the biggest and most widely used projects or libraries, they're not doing probably a whole bunch of research on it, and that can lead to some inaccurate results. So this brings us back to curl and Dan Stenberg, where they made a decision years ago now to stop using the CVSS scoring system, and they instead just use their own knowledge about the actual severity of the issue or the risk of the issue and grade it in a bucket of low, medium, high, or critical. But because they're not adding CVSS scores to CVE records, that means other people are. So Dan explained this story in here where he was notified of this new critical vulnerability in curl, and he goes, well, that's weird. Like, I'm not aware of any new critical vulnerabilities in curl. And it turns out it's a vulnerability they had published, CVE 2024-11053, which was they called it a redirect credential leak vulnerability. So it's an issue that can happen in very certain circumstances for Linux users when they use a specific configuration file in a specific way, and it could potentially leak an HTTP authentication credential to a redirected website. So this very narrow set of circumstances, they graded it as a low risk issue, and that's what they published it as. CISA went in and updated the record and graded it as a 9.1 out of 10, which is a critical issue. And it was pretty quick then for news publications and researchers out there to pick it up as, oh, curl, one of the most widely used libraries out there, has a 9.1 severity critical issue out there. That means vulnerability scanners would start picking that up too and start flagging a critical severity vulnerability on people's networks too. You can see where this could be an issue of that disconnect. Like CISA, their initial grading wasn't ideal. In fact, Dan submitted a pull request to the public repository CISA has for all of this to do an actual CVSS scoring, which he calculated as a 5.3. CISA actually merged it in as a 3.4 instead of that original critical one. But it was already, damage was done at this point. Most tech some tech publications aren't going to go back and say, oh, wait, never mind, that's not a critical, and delete their news post or update it. And so now there's just posts all over there about this 9.1 critical issue in curl that simply doesn't exist.
Yep.
So it was an interesting like blog post about him basically saying the system is flawed and we should not use the system. And CVSS 4.0, which made a bunch of improvements to try and make more accurate numbers, he says it doesn't ultimately do anything on either. It's still a flawed system. And so I thought it was interesting. Like, we've talked a lot internally at WatchGuard through our own vulnerability management process of, a critical vulnerability doesn't mean critical risk. And we try and grade our response and triage and prioritize our response based off risk, not severity. I think that's where the
because we're a CNA, we're able to more accurately use CVSS, including our knowledge of what the real internal impact is. So I think our CVSS scores might be better in general. But to your point, as an enterprise ourselves, when we're looking at external CVSS, we have a risk management process that brings in our own. We consider the CVSS the public impact, the public related impact, but for likelihood, we have our own calculations based on our environment and whether or not we're doing, whether or not we maybe are using the parameters that can actually take a CVSS score and make it a lower severity for our own team, because we know that CVSS has this type of nuance, and sometimes your own implementation can greatly lower the risk. So just like you're saying, I think hopefully the ones we publish are pretty good because we are the vendor and we understand how these products interact with our product. But when we're using external CVSS, we sometimes know that we have to pay attention to the reality of the vulnerability.
And like I respect Dan. He's a extremely talented engineer, clearly. But I think this is where like his disconnect is coming from, is confusing, or not confusing, but conflating severity with risk. And I think we need a severity rating for vulnerabilities, even if like a 10.0 doesn't mean drop everything you're doing to patch it. Just means go investigate it and figure out what the actual risk is.
So I agree with you. As we're talking about this, I don't think CVSS is dead in the pure fact that he doesn't share an alternative. Like, I actually agree with all his problems. He's properly stating problems, and he's sharing where nuance can actually make it have some natural CVS scores be conflated. So I think we all agree kind of with that. But it's the best system we have so far, and he hasn't imposed an alternative. And the alternative can't, we're internally, without transparency, going to have our own system that we don't tell anyone about and we don't interact with the rest of the industry. So whether you love it or hate it in its current form, CVSS is at least that industry standard that's a starting point. And we need these vulnerability scanners to be, yes, sometimes it means there's 9s reported everywhere that are not really that big a deal. But for the most part, I think it works to bring the industry together to at least have a mediocre standard, which is better than no standard at all, to have a starting point. And I think you make the excellent point that a 9 or 10 doesn't mean immediately, you use your brain. We all have our own critical thinking. We can still read the detail of the vulnerability and see how it impacts us directly. Yep. So I think he's good for bringing up the problems, but I don't think you can say CVSS is dead unless he proposes something that works for all industries across the board and is transparent and standardized, because we need a rating.
And I think he's like, if I'm going to put words in his mouth, I think he's burned out from just people, IT professionals, security professionals using CVSS incorrectly. So they're using it as the sole factor in deciding like how to respond to an issue.
Absolutely.
Like in reality, it's one factor, like you mentioned. You need to take into account how are you using that application? Is it even exposed? The exploit code maturity, a 10.0 critical, like theoretical vulnerability is very different from a 10.0 actively exploited vulnerability with source code up on GitHub on how to exploit it.
And at some point, Yeah,
go ahead.
And I kind of agree. Like, the other thing is maybe fed up with tech media not taking enough research on their own. On one hand, I'm actually supportive of tech media paying attention to cybersecurity and holding negligence accountable. But sometimes even authors that you point out that are not my favorite authors anymore, like take these stories and report them with no nuance and make big deals out of something that are patently untrue, or just jump on a 9 without doing a little research to figure out, is this really as bad as it is? Get at least one expert. If it's in a curl library, maybe contact curl before publishing the story to get their response. I think in the 24/7 media cacophony where they want to publish a lot of scary things that get attention immediately, they don't really care about the detail. They want this is critical. Come look at it now because 20 minutes from now I have to move on to something else and you'll never come back to it again. And while I believe in free media to help keep people in line that are really doing bad things, I think media has a bit of a responsibility here, and they probably are part of why. Wow, I already forgot the name. Is it Daniel? I'm scrolling up fast. Why Daniel is maybe fed up, but again, like you, putting potential thoughts in his head.
Now, before we move on, let's at least entertain the thought experiment of, let's say everyone stops using CVSS scoring tomorrow. And maybe we do move to some arbitrary, every vendor just says what they think the risk is, or maybe there's nothing at all. My concern with that would be, would vendors not be incentivized then to downplay the severity of their issues?
Absolutely.
If you're, not to throw stones in glass houses, but if you're Fortinet cranking out critical vulnerabilities every single week for the last couple of months, you might be incentivized to say, actually, this one's really only a low, when the reality might be a little bit different.
Or lean heavily on the user interaction. Yes, there are certain vulnerabilities that a user might has to do a bad configuration. We've had some ourselves, but that doesn't actually mean the initial critical vulnerability wasn't critical. So, we're saying this because even as a vendor, we would have to keep cards on ourselves. Business and profit are a motive that drive a lot of businesses, and I don't think there would be as much transparency, which I think actually is even bad for that business. I think it's much better to have customers fully aware of what even your own vulnerabilities are. And that transparency actually provides customers that want to stay with you. So I think it's ironically good for business to be as transparent as possible. But I agree with you in general. Yes, some businesses would be better actors than others, maybe. But that profit in marketing is a big driver. So it'd be hard to really trust the reliability of it if everyone was just kind of doing their own thing.
Yep.
And more importantly, how would something like a vulnerability scanner work? We all, as companies, need technology to automate finding where we need to update. And all these, rather than going to one source, a database that's kept up, globally, you'd have to go to every individual company that makes software as a vulnerability scanner. And that would kind of, I feel like, put them out of business as far as COGS, which maybe you don't care that you have to pay for a vulnerability scanner anymore, but ultimately that's going to make you more and more insecure over time. So I just think having a standard is important to everyone.
Yep. But if there's one takeaway, it's don't just use CVSS as the single factor for
Absolutely
responding to issues. Take into account other things like your own environment, exploit code maturity, in order to make your decision on whether you need to actually update it or not.
And then for flaws like cryptographic flaws, what sounds big, like a 50% weakness in a cryptography algorithm, may mean it goes from trillions of years to billions of years. And yes, it was a huge hit, but really is taking now 500 million years less secure. You know what I mean? So like you say, do a little analysis of the flaw. CVS is not an excuse to ignore the detail.
Yep, 100%. So moving on, there was another cool research post just last week from Lumen's Black Lotus Labs. And I want to give them credit, even though I really dislike Lumen's reliability when it comes to being an internet service provider sometimes. But so their research lab found what they call the J Magic backdoor, because it uses magic packets to go after Juniper routers. So they wrote a blog post about their research from a campaign.
Should we pause on a magic packet real quick and just read A magic packet isn't necessarily the whole packet, but when we usually talk about magic bytes, they're just a byte sequence that is being looked for. If you see that
Mhm.
byte sequence do something. So to me, a magic packet is still a normal packet. It's just somewhere in the data set, there's going to be a special byte sequence. Is that
Exactly.
accurate?
Yep.
Yeah.
So this campaign, it was active from September 2023 through mid 2024. And this all started when they saw a file uploaded to VirusTotal called Juno Script Service, which mimics the June OS automation scripting service on Juniper routers. They don't know the initial attack vector. All they know is this script ended up on VirusTotal. They don't know how it would end up on a router itself. But they know that when it ends up on a router and when it's executed, takes in two arguments on the command line, one for an interface name and one for a port. And then it renames itself NFSIOD0 to hide as the NFS IO server on the JunoS routers. Then it starts up a function called start
Which is
PCAP
just
listener.
kind of a NFS it's a NFS asynchronous NFS server that you might
Yep,
expect to be on these routers for a legitimate purpose, the real
correct.
one anyways.
So then it spins up a kind of obvious to its purpose named function called start PCAP listener, which then reviews all packets received by the filter on the interface that's provided and looks for specific bytes in certain fields. Like, for example, looks for a certain value at an offset in the TCP options, looks for a very specific TCP options length, looks for certain sequence numbers in the packets, strings following IP headers or TCP headers. I think there's like 5 or 6 different conditions that it goes through for a packet that it receives. And if all of the conditions match, then it spawns a reverse shell and connects back to the IP that sent that packet. So it's basically a way to sit there listening, kind of hidden behind the scenes until a very specific packet from an IP address comes in, gets picked up by that filter, probably dropped by the router itself, assuming there's no route tables to handle it, and that kicks off a reverse shell back to that attacker's IP.
You'll probably get to this, but interestingly, it seems to be based on some pretty public code that has been around for a while. I mean, not the conditions, it seems like, are unique to this threat actor, but the code doing this kind of monitoring, port knocking, spawn
Mhm.
reverse shell is I'm sure we'll get to it, but is something that's been out there publicly for a while.
I think it was like decades even.
Yeah.
So when it connects back, that's not just everything it does. It actually does a challenge response mechanism to prevent
RSA
like
key.
other people from stumbling across it and triggering that reverse shell. It's got
And
like,
I
I think
think
it's
even
5.
researchers, like if even if they didn't know all the sequence to trigger it, they might, if they know at the beginning, they could kind of mass scan the internet and send this to try to see if a router were infected. But it's a little harder to do with the conditions in the RSA key, right?
Yeah, so it creates a random 5 character long string and then encrypts it with a hard coded RSA key as a challenge. And the response must contain that decrypted string, basically proving that you've got the private key for that RSA key pair. So it's to prevent that shell from opening to someone else other than the attacker. They so Lumen looked into their global telemetry for this. Or actually, like you mentioned, real quick before we move on, you're right that this backdoor it seems to be based off of something from I think 2000. So like literally 25 years ago now, which is feels
And
like
there's
the
an
internet didn't
updated
exist in 2000.
version of it. I mean, there's one that was on Packet Storm, which old people may know.
Mm.
There's a lot of evil source, not evil, but scripts and stuff there you can get for old malware. But apparently, there's a newer version of the same name GitHub project that has some updating, and I think it has some classic port knocking where it starts working across different ports too.
Yep. So Lumen being a internet service provider, they've got access to a whole lot of internet traffic. So they started looking through all of their telemetry from March 2004 to September 2004. And they found 36 unique IP addresses around the globe that appeared impacted. 36 is, in the grand scheme of things, pretty small. Like normally when we see attacks against network connected hardware, it's hundreds or thousands.
But it
So
kind
that
of
was kind of interesting.
would suggest nation state level APT style actors who are a little more targeted, maybe.
exactly,
I
versus like
mean,
a
that's
cyber
one
criminal building a
possibility or
botnet.
hypothesis you could draw from a
Yep.
low number of targets.
The bulk of the IP addresses were VPN gateways. So Juniper routers configured to be VPN gateways. The few others, I think there's like a half dozen, were just exposed netconf, which is a configuration, information, and management interface for
Yeah.
JunoS.
They didn't, as they said, they don't know the actual root cause of getting this script on the router, but I wonder if anything about having exposed netconf ports. I mean, you'd still probably need authentication, but is there a vulnerability there? This is
Yep.
purely my speculation, by the way, not the Lumen team.
Yeah, exactly. They looked at the verticals. It was a mix of like construction, heavy machinery, IT, and manufacturing. Interestingly, though, it was primarily in the United Kingdom, Norway, and Russia as the victims, like almost entirely just those countries. So pretty dang targeted. And it was interesting
And
seeing
Russia
Russia
is
in there
interesting. Yeah, that's very
because
interesting.
generally, if it was a threat actor in Russia, as long as they don't target people in Russia as well, they're like
They're
immune from any.
ignored.
Yeah.
And
So this
some of
could
the
indicate someone else.
adversaries we commonly put together, like China and North Korea, seem like they are pro Russia, so would have maybe backdoor agreements not to target each other in their malicious cyber. This is again speculation land, but you'd even think the classic Chinas and North Koreas, it's unusual for them to target Russia, in my opinion.
Picturing them at like the Doctor Evil table, all making sure they've got good rules of engagement until one of them gets launched into the pit of fire for ticking them off.
Yeah, or fed to the Shark Tank,
Who
literally.
is Doctor Evil in this case? Is it Xi Jinping or is it Putin? I'm not sure who. It would have to be Xi Jinping in this
$1
case.
million, Mark. $1 million. I've been frozen for far too long.
Yeah. Anyways, either way, the main takeaway from this, it's tough if you're using network equipment as it's supposed to be. So like a VPN endpoint, you kind of have to have that exposed to the internet. So I guess the main takeaway would be keep it updated to resolve any known vulnerabilities and then just hope that there isn't an
Yeah.
unknown one.
This is our theme, man. We're not throwing stones because we've had one case like this ourselves, which is well taken care of. But clearly, the adversaries are targeting routing devices, which includes a lot of security equipment, virtual and hardware wise. So, what we've been saying for the last 2 years, I feel like patch your routers, pay attention to your VPNs, use MFA on anything that you have to expose, and don't expose any management interfaces that you don't have to.
Yep, 100%. So moving on to the last story, this was another fun one. So last September, we talked about researcher Sam Curry's like latest car hack at the time. This is when he was able to unlock Kias with just a license plate number. He built this whole like web app for being
Yo,
able to do it.
Curry.
It was pretty awesome. But last week, he published a new post called Hacking Subaru, Tracking and Controlling Cars via the Starlink Admin Panel. And real quick, it's not to be confused with SpaceX's Starlink. So it turns out Subaru launched their Starlink car connectivity thing back in 2014, 5 years before SpaceX launched their Starlink. So two
Yeah,
totally
Elon
different
doesn't care
interfaces.
about trademarks.
Apparently not, and apparently Subaru doesn't care about
By the
like
way, this
registering
story starts
trademarks.
with some Oz. I don't know if you, since we're kind of you know doing this without the notes. Don't know if you're going to mention it, but I thought it was really cute that it starts by he bought this Subaru for his mom, with the only caveat that he gets to do some research against it.
Exactly.
What
Bought
a
his mom
sweet
a
guy Sam
Subaru
is.
with the promise that she would let him try and hack it, which is pretty dang cute.
That's cute.
Um,
Yeah,
so
and a good
he
trade
did that
off.
back in 2023, and he spent the next like 2 years trying to find vulnerabilities, but really didn't have much success until this last Thanksgiving, where he finally asked his mom for her credentials to log into the My Subaru app. He poked around in that app for a bit, but actually had really good authorization. He wasn't able to find what he typically finds, like in that Kia set of vulnerabilities for gaining control over it. But he wanted to keep investigating further. And so he actually engaged one of his friends and asked them, hey, do you have any ideas on like what we should look at? And his friend immediately replied back with, hey, have you seen this domain, Subaru cs.com? So it turns out that the my.subaru.com domain for the app was just a CNAME record pointed at this mys.prod.subarucs.com domain. So an entirely different one. So Sam spun up a fuzzing tool to go find different subdomains for it, and ultimately stumbled across portal.prod.subarucs.com, which was the Starlink admin portal. So Starlink being the communication backbone for Subaru cars and computers. So on that portal, he tried logging in. It actually had good access control, or decent access control there. So he started looking at the scripts that it was loading, found one script called starlinkenroll.js in a specific folder. He assumed that there would be other scripts in there, so he used a pretty cool tool called FFUF to start. It basically uses a dictionary to look for other scripts, and he found one called login.js, and that one included a code snippet for sending a password reset without seeming to confirm any token of some sort. Normally when you click a password reset email, it's got a token that the server knows about to verify that you actually got that email to go reset the password.
Nope.
This one just
give me an email and
and
tell me your password and I'll do it for you.
Exactly.
You. What a lovely script.
He predicted if it worked as it was written in the JavaScript, an attacker would just need a valid employee's email to take over their account. So next he went to go try and find valid emails. He found another JavaScript or another endpoint that could let him enumerate email addresses. It was the endpoint for returning a forgot your password challenge question. He then went on LinkedIn and searched for Subaru Starlink and found a bunch of employees, used that as a word list, and ultimately found a valid email address for
He
this
also
portal.
pretty easily found most businesses, honestly, you shouldn't be using the email address as a factor of authentication, even though it technically is as your name. But he did quickly find, most businesses use a pretty standard email technique for every email address, whether it's first name, last name, first initial, last name, blah, blah, blah. He found that pretty quickly.
This is why every WatchGuard employee gets a randomly generated 30-character string for our email addresses instead.
God, I wish and I don't wish. For security people, we would like it, but could you imagine? I guess our contact book would, but it would be a pain in the butt to send emails.
Yep. So he was able to go and reset the email or reset the password for that particular employee. When he went to go log into the
Apparently
portal, though,
there was a John Doe there.
Exactly.
Or a Joe Doe or a Joseph Doe or a Jacob Doe. But either way,
when
J Doe worked.
When he logged into that portal, though, there was a little pop-up that was presumably a second factor that he had to enter in, an unknown thing that he didn't know about. But he went in and just viewed the source code for that and noticed that he could simply remove the source code that showed that pop-up window. And behind the scenes, everything all worked. It didn't actually do any verification. It was basically just like a blur thing to prevent you from seeing
That is true security by obscurity, beyond the pale in your own code. Let's pretend to do MFA to give people the warm and fuzzies.
Yep. So he could just hide that window and now interact fully with the admin portal for Starlink for Subaru. And so through this portal, he could see PII for different owners. He tested it with his mom's car, found that he could track her location from every single time she started her engine for the past year, down to 5 meters of accuracy. He tested with a friend's car where they shared their license plate. He found he could look up their car in the admin panel, add himself as an authorized user to the car, which sent him an email. And then he could then unlock that car remotely and succeeded. And for the victim in this case, his friend, they didn't get any notifications that someone had been added to their car as well. So they had no way of knowing that this was the case. So long story short, he could remote start, stop, lock, unlock, and do location tracking for cars, complete location history for the past year, whole bunch of PII for the customer, including all of their billing info for their My Subaru account. Could access records like call histories with the customers, the previous owner, odometer readings, sales history, a whole bunch of different PII through this pretty powerful portal.
And even though he manually did it through the portal, it looks like he wrote a lovely script called Subaroot that uses the same API to gather all this stuff for you too.
Nice. Good news is he reported it to Subaru and they patched it within 24 hours of his report. So very, very quick response in that case. But so the end of his blog post had a bit of a thought-provoking addendum that I thought was interesting. So he said, quote, "The auto industry is unique in that a 18-year-old employee from Texas can query the billing information of a vehicle in California and it won't set off any alarm bells. It's part of the normal day-to-day job. The employees all have access to a ton of personal information and the whole thing relies on trust. Seems really hard to secure these systems when such a broad access is built into the system by default."
By the way, I greatly disagree with one part of that.
What's that?
The auto industry is unique. I have a feeling there's a lot of IoT devices in the world similar to auto industry, whether it be healthcare, manufacturing, the stuff we bring in our homes, where this is exactly the same in big ways too. I mean, I think his point is it's cars, and yet this is all easy to do. But I don't think it's unique to the audio industry. I think it's unique to many OT and IoT internet connected things we have out there.
Yeah, that's, I think, totally fair and accurate. But the thought of that is like, I agree with him on this. Like, a lot of organizations, you need powerful tools sometimes to manage your systems, to manage your product, service, whatever you have. But a lot of times they don't place enough like protections on it. So if someone were to get compromised, it's nearly impossible to recover.
Yeah, Mark, I totally agree. Like, I think vendors, they need to have their service providers, their support, have access to things. They technically need at least a given route to their customers' accounts to do certain things. But I think like PCI regulation has this right for service providers where one of their checks is there some sort of customer request that allows you to get access to the account? So an example I would give is our Firebox. Our Firebox is not designed to send any critical information or give access to us as a company to a customer's Firebox. But we have a support mechanism both on the Firebox and in the cloud where you can, as a customer, can request us to have access and you have to initiate it and send us a key and then when we can get said access. So you're giving us access to do support, and obviously these car manufacturers need their support reps to be able to do this, but it needs to have some additional authenticated access that's really customer approved and under the customer's attention. So I agree with you that this type of like the company does have to have this access, but they need to put more checks and balances around it. It needs to be authenticated. It shouldn't be automatic, and they should be security testing the heck out of admin portals like this and not just leaving them open with horrible forget my passwords and fake MFA and all that BS. This would be like if Subaru has to follow PCI, this is all kinds of PCI violations, let alone any other compliance.
For God's sake, stop using client-side CSS and JavaScript to control access to applications. Like,
Yeah, I'm going to give the people accessing my application the ability to change things to improve their own access. Oops.
that's nuts. But anyways, this was another cool bit of research from him. I'm looking forward. He made a comment that he's kind of sick of car hacking posts, but I'm looking forward to his next one. He seems to have a lot of
I get
talent
he's
in that
probably
space.
sick of it because there's too many examples of him finding it, but I think it's an industry that much needs improvement. So I definitely, like you, appreciate his posts.
I agree 100%. So hats off, Sam. Looking forward to the next one. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions for us, questions on today's topics, that's how it goes. Suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Blue Sky. I'm at itsmark.me. Corey's at secadept@bluesky. Whatever the default thing is.
Yeah, I'll fix it. I'll get onto your "it's me"
You should.
bandwagon.
Yeah, there you go. And the both of us are on Instagram, technically, at WatchGuard Technologies. WatchGuard underscore Technologies. Yeah.
It's like
I'm not on
barely use
Instagram,
Instagram.
but someone will relay your message to us. So thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
Give this guy a little vacation and he forgets his entire outro script.
Yeah, Jesus.
I'm kidding. You did fantastic.